live stream. And there may be people looking on at home who can benefit from the interpretation. So as you know, this is one of our big ideas discussion events. And it's really about the state of newspaper journalism, newspaper publishing in Trinidad and Tobago today, where it's come from, where it is at, and where it is going, which could be a very contentious topic. And so I'm glad we have such outspoken people on stage. I'm going to hand over now to the host of the event, who will introduce you to the other speakers. But just to say that between these people on stage, the collective experience in journalism in Trinidad and Tobago, in all media, not just print, but radio and TV, is immense. And maybe it's appropriate that we're doing this, one block away from one of our venerable media houses and not far away from the others. The host, of course, this afternoon is Marina Salandy-Brown, sitting at the middle of the stage, who, here at the festival, we know her, of course, as the founder of the Bocas Lit Fest, the president of our board of directors, and the person who had the idea and the tenacity 14, 15 years ago to make all of this happen. But as you probably also know, she is a newspaper columnist. She writes a weekly column in Newsday. So which follows on a long career working with the BBC. So her own media experience is immense. I know she has a lot of opinions about the state of the media, but I think she also wants to draw out the opinions of the others on stage. So I will say no more. I hand you over to Marina and to the panel. Another round of applause to welcome them, and we start the conversation.
Thank you, Nicholas. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks a lot, Nicholas. And wonderful to see so many of you here this afternoon, well, nearly evening, for this session, which is about newspapers. And it is not just about newspapers, but about newspapers in our landscape. And of course, what newspapers do, what they don't do, what they could do. And of course, we have, as Nicholas said, an incredible panel. I'm very honored to have these people around me. I've never met some of, we read one another probably, but we've not actually all met together before. So this is really a treat for me. Thank you very much for coming. Of course, newspapers are important things, but newspaper circulation has been falling everywhere. So it's really quite miraculous that Trinidad and Tobago has not one, but 3 daily newspapers, which is quite extraordinary, really. I mean, if you go to some of the other islands, there's none. There's just a weekly paper, and it's not, it's just a few pages. We have a very rich media environment. It's not perfect, and that's what we want to discuss today. But we also want to focus on the column, because many of our newspapers are full of column inches, and we want to talk about the nature and the quality of some of that opinion and its role. So to join me in doing that, let me just introduce our panel, going from my right to my left. Mark Lyndersay is a Newsday columnist and leader writer for Newsday, and for 26 years, he's had the weekly column Bit Depth, which explores personal technology. He's also the editor of technewstt.com, which is an online news publication. And he's also the editor of the op-ed TT section of trinigoodmedia.com. Mark reckons that between 2001 and 2016, he wrote 2,000 editorial leaders for The Guardian Media Limited. I think that needs a round of applause. What I'm going to do before I introduce everybody, so that you don't forget anything about any of them, I'm going to let that information sink in, and I'm going to ask each person a question. Mark, the question I'm going to ask you is this. Which newspaper, Trinidad and Tobago newspaper, writer or columnist, would you hold up as an exemplar, either living or dead? Use your microphone.
I'd have to say that the person who, coming up as a journalist, really exemplified for me the idea of writing about things in a way that you could both understand and also appreciate his perspective would have been Jeremy Taylor. Jeremy, of course, hasn't written for the papers for a while, but Jeremy was a sound, solid writer, and I found myself once defending him when I wrote a column for the Catholic News, and he was being pilloried by the weeklies for no other reason than the fact that he didn't come from here. And I found that to be manifestly unfair and said a few words, and then ended up having a few more words with Keith Shepherd, because that was Keith, and that was his way, and in the end he just said, well, that's your opinion. And I was like, yes, actually it is. So I would say Jeremy. There have been a few folks who've done things along the way, but one person writing locally, it would have to be Jeremy. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm glad you mentioned Jeremy, because he's one of the people I thought about when I was coming back to live in Trinidad. I thought, Jeremy is there, and so things must be all right. Sitting next to me on my right is Asha Javeed, and she's an award-winning investigative journalist who's now the lead editor of investigations at Guardian Media Limited. She's written widely for local and regional publications on a diverse range of topics, from domestic violence to regional integration. Asha, in shaping your career, which Trinidad and Tobago newspaper writer or journalist most influenced you?
I'll have to say Suniti Mirage. I grew up reading Suniti as a student in school, and then when I started working at the Express, she became my boss. So I learned a lot from her. She taught me how to synthesize my thoughts, how to go after a story, how to humanize a story, and how to sell a story, fundamentally.
Okay, so we're going to come back to some of these icons. We got Jeremy Taylor, we got Suniti Mirage, that's good going. Next to me on my left is Franka, whom many of you know as a food writer. But Franka is actually a media consultant these days, and she's a former features editor of the Guardian newspaper. She's also worked on the Trinidad Express and is a former senior BBC World Service producer. And Franka, you're also an audio producer now, and co-founder of trinigoodmedia.com. Is there a newspaper writer who is your touchstone?
Well,
living or dead?
I would say that the person who I think would have shaped my writing the most is Judy Raymond. When I started working at the Express back in the 90s, Judy was one of the toughest editors to write for, and that was an excellent thing for me. I continued to work with Judy throughout my career. When she was at Caribbean Beat as the editor, I wrote the food column. So having Judy there was also a great thing. And then when I returned to Trinidad, Judy was the editor-in-chief, and she hired me to be the features editor. And that was one of the most enlightening times of my career.
And a very good appointment.
Yes.
So thanks to Judy. Now, before we go on, I just want to park your icons for a little bit, and I want to go to the very fundamental question about what exactly is the role of newspapers today, particularly in our intellectual and political life. And let's start by asking the question, why do we read newspapers? And do you read newspapers?
Okay, so starting from the last question first, I would say that in my experience, across a vast swath of young people that I come into contact with, we do not read newspapers. There are people who continue to read newspapers, and I think the value proposition for a newspaper is something that I call the adjacency of it. You would buy the paper and you'd read something, and then your eye would flick across and see something else. And so, what's this? You know? That doesn't actually happen on the internet. It's actually quite rare that somebody will go to a home page and browse through all the different things. The overwhelming practice is to go directly to a piece. Perhaps it might link to something else, and you go to that. So there's a loss of what we could describe as news adjacency. The sense that a thing could lead to another thing for no other reason than the fact that it is physically next to it. But in losing that, there are other things that happen on the internet and internet publication that we could probably make better use of. So that was a really long question, and I'm not sure I've answered the whole thing.
No, you haven't, Mark. Try again. So you don't read newspapers, and you don't think that we read newspapers?
Okay, so when you say I don't read newspapers, I have not made a habit of picking up a physical paper newspaper every day for years.
Is that your experience, Asha?
Well, I still actively work in the newspaper, so I wake up every single day, and before I do anything, I'm flipping through the online versions to see what's the stories. I read the editorial because inevitably the editorial of the day shapes some of how the news is presented. And for instance, if the editorial attacks the Prime Minister, you know by 8 o'clock you get in a statement on Facebook. So for me, I read the newspaper. I know politicians read the newspaper. I know business people read the newspaper. I know my children do not read the newspaper.
But if you didn't have to read the newspaper, would you read it? And would you enjoy reading it?
It's a habit. I've been doing this for like 20-something years. I can't, even when I'm on vacation, I still want to know what's happening. It's very hard for me to unplug, but that's just me.
Hands up, everybody in this room who reads the Daily News, who takes a physical.
Not physical.
Who actually reads the newspaper physically, a physical copy? Gosh. And how many people read it online?
But they read.
Yeah, so you're reading it.
But they read it.
You're reading it. What about you, Franka?
I find that so very interesting.
Very
figure.
interesting, yeah.
I don't actively buy the newspapers every day. Unlike Asha, I learned to unplug when I left The Guardian, but I do look at the lead stories of the day online. Mark as well has a way of publishing his editorial, so I get a chance to see those, but no, I don't actively buy a newspaper. I would probably buy some on a Sunday or something.
So you're all newspaper veterans. Why do you think this? Why are we not reading newspapers? And why? And if we are reading them, why are we reading them on the internet, where it's not such a great experience?
Let me say that it's not necessarily a bad experience. It is a different experience. It could be a better experience and shaped more to the advantage of newspaper publications. But the thing is that just like you can form a habit of reading a paper newspaper, you can form a habit of effectively reading an online newspaper or an online publication. So I would say that it's a different experience. I would not be so quick, except for some things that are just a consequence of the physicality of the object. But we lose, but we also gain. But that gain has to be intentional, because you have to understand how that news is being consumed. We have a lot of experience understanding how a physical newspaper is consumed, not so much taking advantage of the kinds of technologies and approaches that make consuming a digital newspaper more effective.
I find reading a digital newspaper really boring because there are so many ads, and you don't learn anything except. I have a real problem with the fact that everything is so divided up that when you read a piece online, you're reading that piece online, you don't pick up anything by chance, which was one of the points you made earlier. So I don't find it particularly edifying. I don't know if anybody would agree with me. And do you think there's a problem in reading like that? Want some water?
Well, actually, I think Mark is right. There is a lot of adjacency that we lose when we don't read a paper. And actually, when I have friends who go away and come back, I always tell them, bring a Guardian, bring a New York Times, even if I have read the stories online, because I want to see the layout. I'm interested in how they presented different stories. I want to see the photography. So it is a totally different experience. And I think that therein lies the challenge of why sometimes people don't read the newspapers, because they're probably not very attractive anymore. Sometimes you read Oceans of Grey, and I don't know why that is anymore, but sometimes that could be the challenge.
Go ahead.
No, some of the feedback I get in terms of why people don't read the newspapers is that stories are very long, they're not interesting. And I think what has happened, I think, with social media is people gravitate to their communities and their niche and what they want to read. So people aren't interested in necessarily reading a whole newspaper, maybe a story that interests them or a topic that interests them. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why somebody's not going to buy a whole newspaper to just read that one story if they could get it online.
But do you think that one of the problems is the way that what Franka touched on, that really reading a physical newspaper, of course there must be practicalities that it's harder to get and it costs money and it's free online and all that sort of thing. But is it that newspapers are no longer, well, one, technology means that you don't need to read it, but secondly, that they're not as good as they used to be? Or shouldn't I put a value judgment on it?
Your thoughts on that?
No, I think you should deal with this, Franka, because you've been inside the beast of the belly of the beast.
I don't
Yeah.
think newspapers are as good as they used to be.
Why not?
And there are
And
several
how?
reasons for that. I think we're reaping the whirlwind of not investing in the human resource. So you find that a lot of the journalists or people who get bylines in papers are not adequately trained enough. Sometimes they walk into a newsroom and they don't get the same grounding that we used to get back in the day. We also have a challenge of a paucity of editors. We don't have enough editors who are going to go into a story and dig out, the facts and send the reporter back. I mean, one of the things that Judy is well known for is going into your copy.
And circling with a red
Yeah, and
marker.
also going, while you're working on the story, suddenly something pops up, see me, or needs work, right? And those are the things that I don't think our editors these days, either they're time bound or whatever, but I'm not seeing that kind of rigor.
Also, there's also a lot of pressure on media now, because I think long ago a newspaper would tell the stories of the day before. But now with social media, news is breaking as it happens online. So there's a lot of pressure to produce a product that's not time sensitive, that's taken, advancing a story that's happening in real time. So I think that's one of the challenges that they face right now.
But isn't it a fact that a newspaper is a more reliable source of information, because one has to think it's been through an editor. You've had to find the story, you've had to write it, it's had to be edited, it's got to be, fact-checked. Isn't it better to read a newspaper than to read something online, Mark?
Let me ask you a question. Better than what?
Well, in terms of information and reliability.
On a social media post, for instance.
Okay,
And explanation.
Okay, so if we're going to compare a curated news experience with social media info dumps, there should be no comparison there. However, there is a certain potency associated with who posts, how they post, what they post, and all of those things are separate functions from verifiable fact. So they may have a nodding acquaintance with, but not a fealty or loyalty to. By that regard, any professional journalism operates first from the position of curating, research, justification, background, and here's where I think online publications falter. The online publication of every print newspaper in Trinidad and Tobago is what we used to call rather derisively shovelware. You take what goes into the newspaper and you put it on the net. There's some efforts every now and then, and I like to think that from time to time Newsday does some interesting things with amplifying that. But there are a lot of things that don't happen. Stories don't get tagged. So the actual content management system doesn't associate other stories that should be related to it. Very few stories have actual links in them that either link to previous versions of the story or earlier iterations or background information that was accessible to the reporter that an interested reader might want to investigate. And those are all things that actually enhance the online experience But we're not getting that in a lot of the publications. And that's where some of the problems happen.
How can that be fixed?
It's work. It requires work.
And work means money.
It
human
requires
resources.
people, it
Skilled
requires...
human
yeah.
resource.
Yeah,
What did you say, Asha?
Skilled human resource.
Skilled human
which you have to
resources.
pay for.
Yeah. Money. Okay, so let's talk money. Before we came on, Asha was saying to me, which I did not know to be a fact, that journalists are among the worst paid people in this country.
Yeah.
How many people believe that?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a saying that,
Yeah, amongst
No,
the-
journalists
yeah.
are quite poorly paid.
They're very-
And there's no, the same thing I was saying just now
Yeah.
about reaping the whirlwind. There was a policy of getting people in who were inexpensive and they would work hard and you'd be happy. But we haven't made it a thing of looking for the very best people and paying them commensurate with what their experience or their qualifications
And there's
are.
such a demand because a journalist now has to be like a generalist. You have to know a little bit about politics, energy, the judiciary. You have to learn the processes. You have to learn how the public system moves. So there's a lot of demands placed on these journalists and for the salary that they're paid. So we have a high turnover in media.
And here's the thing you think that might happen. You bring someone in, you train that person, they acquire skills, they improve themselves, they get really, really good, and then they get an offer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that offer may not necessarily or almost never will come from a rival
but they
media
go
house.
around between the same three newspapers.
No, they will leave
Oh.
the entire newspaper business.
Yeah, so
Oh,
a
they
lot
leave
of
the business
trained
altogether.
Yeah.
people that you train and working in corp-com positions in this country that would have former journalists.
I trained a lot of journalists working through the Caribbean Broadcasting Union in Barbados, a lot of them, for nearly 2 years. And in fact, I went to do an interview the other morning in one of the TV station or radio stations, and this young woman came up. She said, "I remember you. You taught me in Barbados." I mean, that was a long time ago. And she remembered me. So I thought, wow, you must have taught her something useful. But I remember a lot of those people saying, "This is great, what you've taught us, but the problem is we now have to go back to our radio stations, and it doesn't work like that." Because, it's lower standards, and of course it's lower standards because, well, radio pays, newspapers don't pay. And therefore it's, perhaps the hiring of people and the quality of people you get is not quite what it should be. In fact, it isn't what it should be from what you say. But how can we change that when it seems to me like the funding model, the financial model doesn't work?
I'm a journalist.
Mark has all the answers,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Well,
No, you have
you're
an
the
answer for this
editor of several things, according to your bio.
Yeah. And none of them make money.
So there you go.
Welcome to the
But
club.
I'll tell you what they do. They do the thing that I think they should do in the best way they possibly can get it done. And why do I do that? Because it's not enough to just say it should look a particular way. I just went in and I looked at the cogs and wheels and said, okay, this is how I make it work this way. It's important to me to understand that process. Now, extrapolating that out into a business model is a complicated thing because you're essentially saying if you improve this vehicle for information, these are things that can happen as a result. But somebody needs to do it and show that that is going to happen. And they have to invest and say, okay, I'm going to spend money on this and I'm going to make that happen. And that's a complicated first step.
We're still in the advertiser model where we depend on advertising for publication. So we would drop a story to make pace for that ad because that ad is paying the story. The story is a story. And I would think sometimes, especially as we're going into general elections, there are peaks when there are a lot more advertising happening because for a general election, there are peaks and then there are dips, So I think into this year, into next year, where there are general elections, media is going to do well. So, so it skews the model because you're seeing that you're doing well on some times, and then there's, you know.
Okay, so newspapers are not making money, so why do we have them? Are they for political reasons? And I also want to talk about the cultural reasons and the role that they play. Why do we have newspapers if they don't? Why are the newspaper owners losing money? Why do they want to go on losing money? Why do we have the newspapers?
I don't think all the newspapers are losing money. And certainly the newspapers that are losing money, or newspaper, has deeper pockets than the other newspapers that may not be losing as much or not losing at all. But what is a fact is that even the newspapers that are making money are not making money at the same scale that they were making it even as recently as 20 years ago.
So why are they doing it?
Because they have a printing press. Because they
the
have
hardware
plants.
is driving it.
There is an engine that is running, and you keep that engine running for as long as you can until one day it just doesn't make sense to run the engine anymore.
So are you saying then that the people who own newspapers have no social conscience? They're not doing it because they think that we need newspapers.
And part of it, you know.
What Marina is trying to say is that newspapers are the things that hold power to account, that the people who own newspapers believe that that's what they're doing, and all those good things that we know that journalism is supposed to do.
Yeah, those things tend to live in the newsroom though, huh?
Yes, they do.
They tend to live there. They don't really leak into the boardroom too often.
No, they don't. But I think it's really important, as Asha said, we are still operating largely on that advertising model. And I don't think subscriptions work quite yet. I've seen in other markets where subscriptions are going guns, newsletters are going guns. But in Trinidad, that doesn't seem to, and in the Caribbean, it doesn't seem that is a workable model.
I think it's because we're also a country that gets a lot of things for free, so nobody wants to pay
That's
for
right.
it.
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about advertising, I think we need to make a discrete difference between advertising for print and advertising for online. Because advertising for print is throwing money into the air and hoping some of it lands on customers. Whereas advertising online is absolutely trackable.
Yes, and targeted.
And as a consequence, people want to know where every single penny fell.
Yeah.
And because they know it can be found, there's a different accounting and way of dealing with that money, which means that it's much more difficult to get serious advertising money out of online. One of the things that has completely confused me is why local newspapers published online publish Google ads. It's just crazy to me because Google ads are pennies and you're putting them right next to ad spaces where you're demanding dollars. And anybody with any decent understanding of programmatic advertising will look at it and say, but I could just put my ad there by specifying by geography, by various verticals and so on, and pay pennies. So that's why at election time, all of your feeds, all of your websites, all of your stuff is going to be flooded with ads for politicians and political advertising.
It started already, yeah?
Yeah, because it's easy to do and it's cheap. So it's a different model entirely, and it's difficult. I'll tell you, it's very difficult to make money off of advertising that way. Major newspapers outside have basically said, whatever we get from advertising is great. We're going for subscriptions. We're going for intense relationships with our customers. We're going for expanded experiences. Like if we have a great arts desk, we'll have an arts festival and our arts people will be on show and expanding the experience that way.
I want to say that I think that if we didn't have newspapers, our social life here would be. I don't mean just social life, but the way our society functions would be negatively impacted. I think that I can't remember hearing a radio station or television channel break a news story. Newspapers do. I mean, the sort of work that Asha does. I mean, where is the Asha Javeed of television or or radio? It just doesn't happen. So all our news really happens in the newspaper. And I think that, we could criticize newspapers, but they are making the stories that actually matter. So we could knock them, but I think they're doing something very useful. And of course, the other thing that they're doing very useful is that we haven't got enough platforms for discussions on a national level about subjects of any sort that are important to us. And I think that newspapers do provide that, and which brings me on to the next subject, part of this discussion I think we should talk about, is the role of newspapers in the cultural landscape of this country and where that is expressed. And it seems to me that when I look at the newspaper, on certain days there's more column inches of opinion than there is news. What is the role, do you think, of that? And do you think that that's how it should be? And do you think what do you think of the quality of that opinion? Franka.
I think the quality of our columns is variable. You have some people who write brilliantly week on week, and you could tell that they've taken the time to research and they've taken the time to really think about what they want to write. You're one of those people. Mark is one of those people. But then there are people who are purely there because the editor decides, okay, I need the following kinds of columnists: a PNM, an opposition, and one other. And sometimes that's the death of that column, because okay, it's good to know where somebody's coming from, but then sometimes the sense in it kind of begins to fail after and dip after a while. I think we have too many columnists. I think some of them need to stop,
Yeah.
right? Because, they're becoming redundant. I also feel that the newspapers need to do as they did in the past, where they would actually amplify their best columnists. I remember working at the Express, and Keith Smith's column was the thing. People bought the Express to read Keith Smith. There's nobody who could have explained Laventil in the way that Keith Smith did. Then there was BC. BC had his approach. People love BC. I loved BC as well. And you find that there are very few columnists that people will say, here now, I had to buy a Guardian. Well, first of all, they ain't buying it. But they don't, and I think what needs to happen, some columnists only exist in their column. We have social media. Columnists need to realize that they are part of all of that. So if I can only see you there, I don't know what else you're for, why am I following you? And that's something that I think newspapers need to work on. More people need to try and probably find different platforms. I see people going to Medium, people going to Substack, to broaden their audience and also to probably make longer points on what they've said in the newspaper. So it's a two-way thing, I feel.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
I think Franka made a good point of too many columnists, because I personally think so. In fact, I would probably read, there's only one or two columnists that I would read weekly.
And why do you read them?
For their perspective, like I do read Rafiq Shah every week because I feel like that's a staple for me. And when Martin Daly has his column, I like Martin's take on stuff. So for me, and they're on a Sunday, I don't miss those columns. But I think a lot of the columnists now that we have, we have so many columnists in the Sunday Guardian. It's a lot. But I think they lack that gravitas, because it's not reading that I want to read. It's not topics that I am interested in. It's not radical thinking. It's not provocative. It's not challenging anything. So I think columnists have to, while it's commentary, it has to challenge something, and I don't think it does. It meets that measure for me.
I like to think of this from the point of view of the audience. we had an audience that consumed a newspaper that consisted of discrete pieces. There was the news, there was the news feature, there were features, there was sports. Today's consumers want to read or get their information from a person that they have empathy with. They don't just want to read the news. They want to know who is giving them this news. What is their position? Where are they coming from? And we're talking studies. I was reporting recently on studies that FT Strategies, which is a kind of experimental, adventurous arm of the Financial Times, and they did a whole long study with young people from India, from America, and from Africa. And the common thread coming through all of them was it wasn't just enough to give me the news. You need to tell me who is giving me this news. Where is their head at? Where is this information coming from relative to them and the publication house, if there is a publication house involved? The news is becoming really personal, and even when you are discussing relatively impartial facts, the implied understanding is that these facts are being offered from a point of view and a perspective, and they only find traction with the audience if they share that point of view and perspective. And that's kind of a big deal, because it is a very big change from what we did before, which was basically to issue a broadsheet or a tabloid paper with all this stuff in it and you consume. Now people can pick and choose what they're going to consume. And the criteria that they use to consume it is going to have a knock-on effect to how that news is produced effectively.
But I still feel, Mark, there's a place, while I get what you're saying, because that's a trend now, I still think there's a place for balance and fair reporting that people can make their own decisions. I mean, as part of the media is to inform and educate. And I think...
And entertain.
Yeah. So I think that there's still space for that, and let people, you're trusting that people would read this and make informed decisions for their lives with that information that you've provided. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I think that columnists have a freedom that journalists, news reporters don't have.
Agreed.
Because you can say whatever you want to say. Yeah. It's opinion.
Yeah.
But that is limited. Well, everybody knows I'm the person who raised most of the sponsorship for the Bocas Fest, right? Mm. But I'm a private individual, and I've been writing a column before I got involved in all of this. And I wrote a piece about, it was just when the banks were going into digital banking, online banking. And I just wrote a piece called something like Online Hell or something like that, about this terrible phase that we were going through while banks were sorting themselves out. And, one of our sponsors wrote to me and said, you shouldn't be writing that kind of column. And I wrote back and I said, I'm sorry, I'm a private individual. But I think that this is one of the problems, that nobody actually wants to say anything because everybody's too terrified of the
backlash.
Yes, what's going to happen to me if I tell the truth? Now, I really do think there's a place for the truth, and the truth must be told somehow or other. And I think this is why perhaps columnists are there. They're a bit like fiction writers in a way, because you can say, I mean, what you write in fiction can't be anything near what real life is like. And I think columnists enjoy that kind of freedom. And I think maybe that's why newspapers want them to be there, because, I mean, anyway, I must say nobody ever calls me up and briefs me on anything and says, I want you to write anything, that resembles what they want me to say. So, but I do think there's room for that.
I think sometimes columnists are supposed to ideally build on the news of the day or expand it or explain it to the population, ideally. Yes, they have their individual thought process, their experiences that they share, but if a column is attached to a newspaper, very often we find that, like I'm writing about Nikon, for example, so a couple of our columnists would write about this and explain it to the population of why this story is a news story, why does it matter, how will it affect the population if, well, I don't know what's going to happen with it, but you know.
I found that as well. I found as an editor, it's very useful to have relationships with your columnists. So you could say, okay, here what? This is what we're talking about. How can you address it? Or this is your strength. Why not write about X? It's not often you do it, but they take it on board and they realize that, okay, maybe I need to keep up a little bit more with what's happening in the zeitgeist of the paper. But yeah, I think it's good to have a relationship with your columnists so that you'll be able to not necessarily guide, but make them a little more relevant to the audience.
Yeah, especially if your columnist is like a doctor, like with COVID. You want to explain to the population, okay, the opposition is saying this about vaccines, the government is saying this, and you take your doctor columnist and said, well, here what? Could you demystify this and tell our readers what is factual? So that's an example.
I think there's a fair amount of room for the idea of what is a columnist. I think columnists can be fanciful to the point of fictional abstraction. I think columnists can express strong views about matters of fact that are in the public domain. And yes, columnists can explain things that are of current interest. And so, for instance, a lot of the writing I do in my column vacillates wildly. Sometimes it's an interview. Sometimes it's an investigation into something and an explanation of it. Sometimes it's a complete opinion piece about something that people are not yet aware of. One of the taglines that I work with in my head with Tech News TT is that I'm reporting from the future. The things that I'm talking about now, 6 months down the road, so, oh, that's what you was talking about. Yeah, well, sometimes I do have to start the ball rolling on that. So I don't think we should think of columnists only as one thing or another thing. And more importantly, an effective columnist shouldn't be the same thing every week, because you have a duty to excite and engage and entertain the person who is taking the time to read your work. Not pander, but that engagement is the same as if you're having a conversation with a friend. You're not going to tell me the same story again and again and again and again. You bring new experiences to it. You bring new perceptions, new discoveries, and you pull all of that into that space.
It's interesting that you mentioned that Jeremy Taylor was your touchstone, because Jeremy Taylor wrote a column for 10 years, and I've known him for decades, from long before he actually started writing his column. And he sent me an email, and he said, "Are you still doing that session in the festival?" And I said, "Yes." And he wrote this to me, which I want to share with you, because I think it's spot on. He says, "I think a columnist, above all, has to write well, whether serious or humorous, passionate or subversive. The writing needs to be good. There are too many columnists churning out heavy, turgid, repetitive prose, predictably rehashing the news topics of the last week without having had a fresh thought in years. Secondly, a columnist must have something worthwhile to say, something to merit the space being taken up on the page. I want the writer to make me laugh, or at least smile, with a fresh thought or idea or argument, or make me think about something I haven't thought about before or haven't understood. Someone who can deliver a good aha moment. Then a columnist has to be seriously well informed, not just raking over the news reports, but offering something extra. New information, or new connections, or new patterns, or meaning discerned in the public turmoil. Also, a columnist must be able to tell the truth when the occasion demands, even if it's about themselves. Honesty can require a lot of courage, attract condemnation, personal insults, threats, but the alternative is shameful. And I think that that's one of the reasons that people like B.C. Pires, who kept his column going for 35 years, was just so popular. I think that when B.C. died, he would have been surprised by the public outpouring of affection for him, because I think he did all of those things. And he had that wonderful light touch about him, but always there was something serious that he was talking about. that enabled us to engage with it and was not threatening to anybody. And he invented new words, which is something really important about, I want to go on to talk a little bit about the role of newspaper and newspaper writing in the literary landscape. I mean, Ira Mather is here, and Ira Mather, I know, has been a multimedia journalist, but, Ira wrote a nonfiction book that won the nonfiction prize, the Osem Bocas Prize last year. So I think that, if there'd been prizes, people like Wayne Brown and B.C. Pires and Keith Smith would have won those prizes, because they didn't only do two things, which is record history. And I think that's something we haven't discussed, is the role of columns and newspapers as very, very important, archive, a lot of people who go back to do really original research that actually negates a lot of the colonial history, finds that stuff in newspapers. And then they have to delve and delve. But newspapers have a really important role, Mark, and I think that if you just relate that to the what's happening with taking it all online, is that maybe some of that, I don't know, maybe some of that might be lost. I mean, I don't know how big the cloud is, but it's not so easily retrievable. So I do think that the literary aspect is really, really important. I think a lot of people, Wayne Brown, for example, and it was a beautiful thing to read their piece. Like, it wasn't just about Lavent, it was how they told those stories. Yeah. So do we think that newspapers now are, well, I think, but I don't know whether you agree with me, and don't say yes or no, I want you to elaborate. Do you actually think that newspapers are failing in that way? Or do you think there's merit in them having this cultural role?
I'll be honest and say that I don't think many of the people working in newsrooms today think about things like that. I don't think they fully appreciate and understand that the role of the newspaper is to influence and to inform that cultural landscape. And I rather suspect that somebody like BC, somebody like Keith, those kind of columns had an impact because the people for whom they wrote appreciated them. Not just the audience, but the editors, the newspaper owners. At the Express, Keith Smith was revered. And wherever BC went, he was as well. And while you were talking, I was looking at Mark and thinking, the kind of work, for example, that BC did in the Turning to the Bone, where he interviewed somebody and Mark accompanied the photos, you got so much humanity out of those pieces. And I think that's what people want. It spoke to what you were talking about earlier, about people knowing who was giving them the news. What I think newspapers, and in fact what I think the media is lacking, and it's not for want of trying, but there's a certain amount of the human interest that is lacking. And that's why when stories like this man's grandmother, who's 106, who still goes to the gym, I don't know if you all saw that story. She's 106 years old and she's still working out. I mean, not as intensely as you probably would, but the fact is that you saw somebody that you think, oh my God, I wonder if I would be half as able when I'm 70. And that reminds you of my granny. Those are the most popular things because, again, you touch the humanity.
But Franka, do you think it's because of how social media has changed the way we consume media?
There is that as well.
Like the people, like long ago, there was B.C. Pires and Keith Smith, but now we have so much different. The landscape is so democratized, and the media landscape is so democratized that you don't have that quality and that kind of individual person kind of making that mark the way Keith Smith or BC would.
But I think cream rises to the top, though, and there are many people out there who do this every day on social media. Every day they have a comment about something, and you have to wonder, why don't you just shut up? Because after a while it becomes boring, right? But the people who really do make statements, who say things that make sense and that apply, those are the ones who are best received. I think there is a space in social media. Again, I go back to the fact that there's so many platforms. There's Medium, there's Substack, there's TikTok even.
Yeah.
And our columnists could do well, some of them, by engaging on those platforms.
I'd like to invite you to be part of this conversation because this is about you as readers and many writers. Is there a microphone, a roving microphone? Just put your hand up. Okay, here, Celeste.
Hi, good evening, afternoon, whatever. Thank you for this really engaging discussion. You said something, Marina, that I didn't think about, but it makes a lot of sense. Newspapers provide a contemporaneous record of the concerns of a time, and not just the big concerns, but also the minutiae of life, you know. And I know this because if I have to do research for my writing, I go to newspapers. I want to see what people were buying, petticoats with frills, what were they talking about, what were the concerns. And being part of the panel tomorrow, where we're going to be looking at the writing of Sipasad Naipaul, who was a journalist as well, and reading all that has been prepared for that, it's true that you look at what was written in that time in the newspaper by him, columnists, and you look at now, and you get to see that so little has changed in Trinidad society in some ways, even though so many other things have changed, right? The other thing I wanted to say is, Franka, you keep talking about this nexus between social media and the print. And I feel like young people might be more engaged in buying newspapers, and so if there was a bit of a, I would call it backwards osmosis, why can't we talk, instead of newspaper columnists just going online to find a space, why can't we talk in the print newspaper about stuff that is happening online?
So as you talked about young people, and this kept going through my mind, one of the things that I think worked really well in its time was something called Vox, which was a junior publication, well, I wouldn't say junior, but a young people's publication that Lenny Grant at the Express championed and encouraged. And I'm happy to say that so many of the people who started at Vox, Lisa Allen Agostini, still in the media and still writing. So the newspapers have to find that. You see that sweet spot? That sweet spot of where a young person could say, you know what, let me pick up that for that. And you have to strategize about how you're going to make this work across the different platforms. How are you going to make a Vox of today work on social media? And how are you going to, as you say, reverse engineer that into the paper? That's a lot of thinking, and that's something that probably needs to happen. If we're going to pull young people back to newspapers, I think something like that is what can do it.
Have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I like the point that she raised about being able to go back to a resource, and newspapers were a cheap way to enshrine information, and there isn't a ready parallel for that digitally. So we're already seeing newspapers going away abroad, resources locally just being lost. The website goes down, nobody knows where the data is. So that aspect of preserving information is a valid concern. That said, I will point out that my own conversations and engagements with young people about how they get information suggests a very strong trend towards what I would have to call capsulizing. They get information in little capsules from all over the place. And they have their places where they get these capsules of information. And sometimes those capsules lead to other sources of information. But I'm not quite sure how an established centuries-old medium makes a translation effectively into what is a fundamentally different way of acquiring information. But it's not something we can ignore, because that generation is going to grow up And that's the way they will find their information. So that's a thing that has to be wrestled with.
I have to say, my daughter is 10 years old, and my daughter is 10 years old, and she's probably never picked up a newspaper. so, and then my son is 20, and he's like, send me a link. So I don't.
Maybe we just have to accept that young people will be communicating differently, and the values have changed and are changing, and that's how it will be.
Have you talked to a 15-year-old?
Not recently, I don't think.
They're already talking differently.
Yeah. But you know, Celeste, I remember that that wonderful woman who started Newsday, Therese Mills. She once said to me that she was a wonderful writer, by the way, fantastic writer. She said, I tell all my young journalists that they have to read the entire newspaper, including the ads, because when you read the ads, you know what everybody's doing. And in fact, if you go back to some of the new bits of work that are coming through, I think of Carnival Clips from Camboulay, done by John Cowley. And a lot of that book goes back, and he doesn't just find, it's that original research. That's the text about that whole, about that subject area. And he went back to all his sources, nearly all his sources, his news sources, were newspapers and ads. He knew when when the musicians turned up, where they were going, who they were recording for. Most of it was through the ads, and this goes to 1900 and whenever. So it's really, really an important archive.
That is something that when I worked with Lenny Grant, he made it a real thing to actually look at the ads and find stories from ads. And it's something that is important. You need to know what's going on around you.
Yeah. I mean, the Express lead story today is from an ad in their newspaper.
Exactly.
Yes, microphone over here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I have 3 20-year-old children, right, in their 20s, and yeah, 3. And they find the news totally depressing, actually. They're like, why do you all watch, why do you all, they want to often know why are we watching or reading the papers. And as you say, they just want to get almost like titles. Okay, that's what happened, okay, but they don't necessarily want to read a story. And I want to reinforce what Celeste said, because when The Guardian did that supplement, I think it was for 50th anniversary of independence, where they reprinted the newspaper from 1962. I mean, I learned so much there. I even found a little article about my great uncle who had a boat accident and was burnt in that newspaper. Like, it's incredible, and so I think newspapers definitely have a value, especially for that, like from a research, and they keep that, but I don't know how we can bridge the gap with the social media generation now. I mean, that's a big conversation, I really think, that needs a lot of research.
Over here?
Marina, this is such a rich session. I'm sure I can't be the only one who's been triggered by a lot of the things that everyone has said. You opened with the thing about, well, you're praising Trinidad and Tobago for having 3 newspapers. I remember Raoul Pantin telling me we had 11, and he listed all of them, and reminded me too that we had evening news. So why have we stopped reading the newspapers? It can't just be the internet, because as Marcus pointed out, we're just going there for bites. I certainly can't get, yes, Loop TT is ahead of everybody with the news. But I can't read on Loop TT about presidential pardon for $2.3 million US. The newspapers clearly are providing a service. People are still reading it, not like me, for the tactile sense every morning with my coffee of the paper between my fingers. But people are still reading it. I'd like to ask the panel, what do your marketing people tell you? What do they tell you what to, what to say, or what do they tell you when you have your meetings? Does anybody know why people are still reading newspapers? I am, because of my age, but as the other speaker said, the kids just seem to want bites. But the kids don't buy newspapers, and they're still making a living. So Marina, the panel, why are people reading what you're writing?
Mark, would you like to have a response?
That was a really, really long statement. Take a chunk out of that and ask me that. I mean, one of the things I can point out about this is that when I began dealing with newspapers, because before I ever started writing for newspapers, I used to deliver newspapers. I had a little route in Woodbrook. And in order for the Sunday Guardian to meet its press time, they had to start printing the Sunday Guardian at midday on Saturday, because there were 150,000 copies that had to be printed. And I look back on that and I think, I don't know that there's a press run of that scale anywhere in Trinidad for any newspaper, for any event since that era. That's just a different era. And that was kind of a hallmark. The Sunday Guardian was the paper. It was a big, heavy thing I knew because I used to deliver it. You had to fold it just like that, or else it would explode into confetti in people's yards, and they weren't overjoyed when that happened. If you did fold it well, there's a good chance you'd knock over their flower pots, because it was a missile. But there's a kind of hard reality of going like, okay, I used to do that and that was great, and now I'm doing this and it's also great, but it is manifestly different. My concern is that in understanding where we were and where we are, how do we take the best aspects of where we were and migrate that practically to where we are? And that's a big challenge, not something this panel is going to solve. It's not something that any one single newspaper or media house is going to solve. But until we start to grapple with it, and coming back to the point raised by, I think it was Celeste, someone said, how we find a way to archive the information that is being published only online in a way that it is retrievable years, decades, perhaps even centuries from now, is a kind of huge challenge, because I don't think anybody worried about newspapers. The library would have a copy and it would be at the archive. So there was always a copy of the newspaper somewhere. But the responsibility for every publication now that exists online rests with the publisher. And that's not always their big concern. So those are also things that have to be wrestled with. If you're going to treat this thing as a document of record, then there has to be a way to establish that it is a record, which is to say it is retrievable, accessible, and can be consulted after a certain amount of time has passed. So, yeah.
Thank you.
My job.
I'm with Mark on that. I think it's very difficult. It's going to become difficult for people who publish online only because of that whole thing of keeping up with your hosting, for example, and making sure that there's a good record. Even now with audio, it's you know that it's more difficult now to find things online when a link breaks and you haven't seen it, you're not going to get it back. So it is a problem. But I think Mark is right. We do have to find a way of bringing the best of what we had before to now. I just feel so strange saying that, but yeah.
All of it.
Yeah.
There's microphone here and then at the back. Yeah. Oh, she got the phone. Yeah, you got the mic. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I just want to.
Can you hold it closer?
Sorry,
to your mouth?
ask the panel what they think in terms of. Personally, I find when I'm reading any of the papers in Trinidad, there's an issue that there is a lack of follow-up of stories. So, you get a story in the newspaper. Anything I have ever personally been involved in that I've read a report about in the newspaper is not accurate to start with. And there is not enough information, so I know that people want to read more short, pithy articles. And the way in which that they're written then, sometimes you don't get the depth that you need, but there's not the follow-through. So it's not like, I need to get the paper tomorrow to find out what happened next. So stories bubble up, and then they just disappear, right? So I think that that's something that would really, that there are many, many local stories that are of interest. There are many stories that are to do with the way in which money is being spent by the government, the way in which the land is being used in this country, the way that, I mean, there's a multitude of interesting stories. There's also a lot more stories that are at the level of community, which again are not followed up and are not in depth. So many of us read the international news online, so we don't need to read the newspapers for those. We want to hear about the stories that are affecting us in Trinidad and Tobago, and also more stories about the region, because I think there's a lack of information about the region. Thank you.
Asha, would you like to respond to that, please?
Okay, I'll just use my work for example, right? You spoke about follow-ups. I will say, first, there's a lot of news happening. There is a lot of news happening. Every single day when we have our 9 a.m. meeting, we have to decide which resources are going to be put to follow which stories. So I don't think it's not for lack of not wanting to follow stories. I think there's a lot of news happening, and you just have to prioritize which ones you're going to follow. I would say, like, for me, for instance, I went from covering an oil spill to covering the SSA to Massey to Naikwan to all in the space of it was a lot, you know. And I was like, I went to my boss, I was like, I need 2 days off, you know. So what I will say, in all those stories, there were follow-up stories with the SSA. There was, every day we had a follow-up story, so we were updating the country. I would say, even with Massey, even with Naikwan, look, I've been writing about Naikwan for years. I think I'm the only journalist in this country who has written so much about Naikwan, to the fact that, okay, the plant is now going to be mothballed, right? So I would say in certain stories, you do get follow-ups. I think in the human interest stories, the Hannah Matura story, for instance, we have been on top of that. We have been following it. The babies, what's happening in the hospital right now. Every single day for the last 2 weeks, we have had stories about babies in our hospitals and what is happening. So I think it's not that we're not following stories. Sometimes also it's a consumption issue. It's like, what are you interested in? Are you interested in those stories, or are you interested in other stories that you'd like to see followed up? You know, so for us, we just prioritize what is public interest, what is the masses, what is appealing to the most people, and those are the stories.
But Asha, are there enough people on the papers following these stories? Maybe there's not enough. Maybe there's just not enough talent.
There's always staff issues. Yeah, there's no newsroom I know in this country that has enough people to follow all these stories that need to be followed. And just to your last point about following the government and money being spent, I think we do a really good job on the media on the whole in terms of trying to keep the government accountable. Yes. I think the government is not very good at answering questions to the media. But I do think we try, and I think you get better answers in Parliament than you do from journalists asking questions.
Yeah, I agree. I did a consultancy with a media company last year, and I was totally shocked at how few people there were in there trying to create the news. And it's not that they didn't want to do it, but it was just simply, let's say on a good day, you had 5 journalists in the newsroom, and you had 20 stories that were on the assignment list that needed covering, you know, and then, you know, you ask yourself, well, how do we solve this? What's the quick solution to this? Is it that we run to Costart and we hug up the interns and bring them over. No, that's not the solution. But then, what do? We just have so much out there to cover, and there's so few people to cover it. I think.
Yeah, but then you're looking at a time issue because
Yes,
news is
well,
1 hour a night with
exactly.
chock full of ads, and then you have a space issue in a newspaper because without advertising, the newspaper shrinks, and then you have limited space that you could put stories on.
I mean, these are not excuses. These are just
The
facts.
The reality. There was somebody at the back.
Hello,
Hi.
Franka dear. I came by to see my friend Franka and listen to her perspectives, and nothing that Franka said surprised me, but one thing jumped out from the panel, and that's the conversation started at the newspaper offers. The news stories more or less dictate the conversation on radio, it dictates the conversation online, the headlines, be it sensational or not, it ends up being shared, and that's where the conversation begins by 9 a.m. And we become outraged, and then we forget that headline tomorrow, and we go on to something else. So I believe that newspapers and news stories, the editorials, it's so relevant. A couple years ago, I started to take the newspaper to class, and I say a couple years ago, at least 6 years ago, I took the newspapers to class, an actual newspaper to class, to start conversations with my students, and it went well. And following COVID, we just talk about the news stories, and I didn't take the actual newspaper to class, so that's why I kind of gravitated towards what was being said about that, the actual newspaper being read. And what I saw really was the lack of interest in news stories by the younger ones. And when I say younger ones, 25 and under. But they are listening to the news stories, they are listening to the story of the day, and they have little opinion on it because they didn't delve into it. They are hearing the opinions of people, and they are forming their opinions on opinions. But when they start to actually read the story and analyze themselves, they have a change of thought. And that, for me, says, hey, we have a little more work to do with regards to where we present these stories. It's not just on the printed paper, but how we present it to them digitally. Is it appealing? Is it making them want to read? And that's my little concern, more so as an educator, because you have a little more work to do, or you have to work differently to get that consumption, because I believe that there is a responsibility of the press to make sure that our stories are reaching. That's my little 2 cents on what was said.
Well, you know, this is all happening in the context of people wanting to know less and less. A lot of people who teach, a lot of people in America, in Ivy League universities, are pulling their hair out because their students do not want to know. They said, we don't need to know that. I can think of a very learned professor from Cambridge. In fact, he taught Prince Charles history. And he moved to one of the Ivy League universities in America, and I remember having a conversation with him on the phone, and he was almost in tears. He said these young people, they do not believe in history. They said to me, I do not want to know what happened in the 18th or 19th century. It's irrelevant now. Well, we all know that that can't be true. And it's a real problem. I was talking, you talk to any academic person in the universities, it doesn't matter how good the university is or how poor it is. Young people do not want all that information. I mean, Asha was just telling us that her young people just want to read, things about 100 words long, maybe 50 words long. So how do we get them to go back and analyze? I mean, that is a real challenge. I don't know if anybody's got any answers to that. But
I don't know if we could go back. I think we just have to modify moving forward.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, I want to move on to the future, because maybe there is no future.
Oh, Well, I mean, I will be out of
That won't be a good
Marina.
thing. No.
Maybe we don't have any journalists. I wanted to read you something. It says, of course, you know, we all know what's going on. Although about the loss of jobs in editorial control and accuracy, although U.S. newspapers employed 458,000 people in 1990, by 2016, the figure was 183,000. That's over 60% drop. And if you remember who these, my learned panel said, were their touchstones, we wouldn't have people like that passing on anything to anybody anymore. So it just feeds into this, what's happening generally in society with people wanting to know less and less. And there'll be fewer and fewer people who know anything to teach them anything. Is that a terrible thought?
Let me just say that I don't think it's true that young people don't want to know anything. I think it is sometimes puzzling, the things they want to know everything about. So they will decide that this is a thing they want to know about, and it's inexplicable to me. But they will spend hours looking at videos and having people talk to them and reading links about it and asking me to print out a picture about it, and they have this deep interest in the inexplicable. And I would say my response to that is, I support your interest. I do not share your interest, but I will engage it and move along with it, because the things that the next generation and the generation that we're living with now will find interesting and appropriate to their lives are not the things that we grew up with.
That's right.
I cannot sell a young person with actual cash the idea of spinning a top. That's just not going to work. It's not going to happen. I can just barely squeeze by the idea of how to shape your hand to pitch a marble. But once they figure out, okay, that's it, the marble is pitched, they're done. That's it. They don't need to know anything else. But while the things that intrigue them may be unusual, the way they process that information and the way they access it give us insight into the kind of conduits that they will be tapping into and where the presence has to be. So it's, no, you're not traveling the highway I understand, you're not traveling the roads that I know, but you're going somewhere. I just need to figure out where it is and try to make sure that some of the stuff you actually need to know to survive in life is to be found along that path. So yeah, that's my thought about it. I don't think there's no future. It's just going to be a really, really strange future.
Mark, you write a lot about tech and the future, and is AI going to replace all of us who work in the media?
There's a lot of me to replace with AI. Yeah? I don't know that they have a large enough language model to replace me yet, but AI is obviously going to replace some things. It's going to replace some things to the detriment of the learning process in some cases. Every university is complaining about the increasing sophistication of the absolutely fake papers that they're being handed and asked to mark. The papers are getting more sophisticated. They're beating anti-AI systems. I know people who are talking about the fact like, I'm going to have orals. You're going to sit in front of me and talk to me as a way of dealing with that. AI, like every major technological development, is going to be a boon and it is going to be a problem. There are things that nobody wants to do that AI will do very well, and we'll be very happy to let it do that. I wish I could figure out how to get it to wash wares, but that apparently is not one of the things it's going to be good at. But it's also something that, as disturbing as it is to say this early in the innovation of a new technology, with the scope and the breadth that it has already demonstrated, and we're still very much in early days now, there's probably going to be needed some level of regulation and awareness of the scope of how it affects day-to-day life. So things like learning, processing of information, that we're still trying to figure out. So, yeah.
Can you actually tell when AI has written something?
Yeah.
Can you detect it?
Yes, you can.
Can you? How?
It's bland.
Yeah.
You know, there's no
There's
color,
no-
no flair.
yeah.
There's no flavor.
Well, that's not always true.
What did you do?
Okay, so the Bocas at Fest has an annual report, and as the president, I have to write a statement. So I wrote a statement, and our team member who's responsible for delivering the final product, she did an AI test. She said she told it to sprinkle it with diamonds and something. And this, the Spanish ambassador is here, so he will know what I'm talking about. This came back as a very sort of florid 17th or 17th century sort of text. And it was like a translation from, you know, the golden age of Spanish literature to modern English. And I thought, what?
Yeah.
It was totally inappropriate. It was
So
Yeah,
you know it's
that's all you
AI.
know. So you
so
know it's
it
AI.
wasn't bland at all. It was just the opposite.
Yeah.
It was too fairy-like.
Yeah.
I want to make a point about the future, and I want to make a point that for the last few months, if you've been following the media around the world, especially in the United States, you'll see how many redundancies and people have been fired and things are closing down. And I think that we can arrest that here. We can. And I don't feel that it's bad. The future is not bad. We just have to invest in the future, but we have to know what we want out of the future first. And I think that's where our newspaper, our media owners need to take a little more time, you know, think through that vision, understand your role in democracy, understand your role in shaping the cultural landscape, understand your role in, you know, bringing up the next generation of journalists, and actually invest in it. I think if we did that, we would be able to stave off that bleak future that I'm seeing in other places. And also to invest in new technologies. No newspaper has a podcast.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know you might come with one, eh?
No, but I do think we need to embrace AI. It is going to be part of the future, and whatever comes to it, we can manage and mitigate, but we have to embrace it, because if we don't, we're going to be left behind, you know, in many instances. Yeah.
Closing remarks, Mark?
I'm sorry?
Closing remarks from you about the future?
More remarks?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I came here to really say is that I thought that given the tone and tenor of how news is consumed globally, and particularly globally among the next generation, that there's a very real likelihood that the strongest players are going to be the most identifiable players. They will be the reporters, they will be the commentators, they will be the sports analysts who have a distinct, clear personality, a very, very obvious approach, and who speak to a part of the audience that responds to that conversation. I don't think they necessarily are going to be speaking to a majority, but they will speak to a decisive minority. And if you have enough of them, then you have an engaged audience. And that's likely to be the profile of the news media consumer in the decade and decades to come.
I want to thank you for this panel. I thought it's been very interesting for me. I hope it's been interesting for you all. I do want to alert you to the fact that C. Prasad Naipaul, who was V.S. Naipaul's father, he wrote many columns and been collected, and that book is being launched on Sunday. I think it's Sunday, and I will urge you to look that book out and also try and make a date for that session. I just say that I want to close by saying that I hope that, with all the inevitability of the future, that somehow our human creativity, which is an incredible thing, manages to keep a presence somehow in all of this, and we don't all end up being too robotic. Thank you all, everybody. And the festival continues until Sunday, and please keep coming. It's wonderful to have you.